Hi everyone, welcome to week 5 of our course. This week we're going to talk about the new funding model and how funding works right now in Saskatchewan. Now to talk about that this week, we're going to review the old FOG just a little bit, talk about why it went down the way that it went down, connect it to some of those articles that we talked about first class, and then talk about the new model and how funds are distributed. So let's get started right away with just a quick review. On our first PowerPoint presentation, we talked about why there are restrictions on education funding. And in Saskatchewan, it's because education is in competition with other ministries, other departments. And health is probably our largest competitor, but there are other areas of competition as well, social services and things like that. Now, the biggest difference between the old funding formula and the new funding formula is although they were structured fairly similarly, with both of them being foundational operating grants, and you'll see references to what a foundation grant is in your textbook, the biggest difference, and the one that people remember the most, is that the old funding formula had about 60% of the funding coming from property taxes, and the new funding formula has about 40% of the funding for education coming from property taxes. That means with the old formula, 40% of the cost of education came from the general revenue fund, and with the new funding formula, 60% of the cost of funding education comes from the general revenue fund. So if I cleverly switch between these two slides here, you'll see that the biggest change that people notice about and talk about all the time is mostly percentages. There is one significant change that is behind all of this that school boards feel the pressure from, and that always doesn't get talked about in the media, and that is the way that the money is actually distributed. The way that funding is distributed in our province now is different from what it used to be in 2009 and before. So we'll talk about that today. The old FOG, and it was called FOG for a joke, you know, it's a little foggy, we don't understand it, was actually the acronym for Foundation Operating Grant. And it's called Foundation because a foundational grant or a foundation grant has a base amount to it, and then other things added on top to make it more fair or more equitable. But a foundation grant, or anytime you talk about foundation, you're talking about a base level of funding that everybody gets, and then they get little add-ups or little additions to their budget envelopes depending on certain characteristics of their schools. Now, the old way, what used to happen is boards would actually submit a budget of what they wanted for the year. So they would actually submit what they thought they needed in order to get through the school year. They would lobby their constituents, they would ask the exec council, ask principals and sometimes teachers and students about what it is that they needed for the school year, and then they would write up a budget. And most of the time those budgets were fairly reasonable. So the government would discuss it, and then they would determine how much money that school board would get based on the division's recognized costs. And then the government would give the school division an envelope. Then, well, I don't know if it was technically an envelope, but they called it an envelope. They would tell them how much money that the government was going to give them for their funding. And then the school division would set a mill rate that would allow them to collect the rest of their budget off property taxes. And we'll talk about mill rates in about 3 weeks or so, and I'll show you how you can calculate what a mill rate does to your taxes. But basically, mill means 1,000th. And so a mill rate, if it's 16, your property values, your assessed property values would be multiplied by 0.0 and then the mill rate to determine how much you would pay for taxes. Then that's how the school division would get their money. They would take the envelope that they got from the government, they would determine what all the property assessments in their area were worth, and then calculate how much money they would get if they set the mill rate at 16, 17, 18. They would set the mill rate, people would know that they'd have to pay a certain amount, and then that school division would get their funding. When they held off on allowing school divisions to set their own mill rate in 2009, the government promised everybody that they would come out with a new funding formula a couple years later. And so what they had to do was put into effect an interim formula. And what the interim formula was kind of a way to put school divisions on a holding pattern. And so what they said to school divisions was that they would give them about the same amount of money that was in their operating grants that they were using for that current school year, which would have been 2008-2009. Some school divisions got very upset with this because they had been taking away a little bit of money from their operating grants and putting it into savings so that they could save for new buildings or other large projects. And the government said, I don't care, you're still getting that amount because obviously you don't need all of the money if you're saving up for something else, so we're going to use this amount. And the government promised that the interim formula would last only 2 years, but in effect it ended up lasting 3. On top of that interim formula or interim envelope, the government added about 2% to account for inflation, enrollment, and salary increases, but that didn't cover it for most school divisions. And then they told school divisions that they had to submit a balanced budget that would equal the exact amount of money that the government was giving the school divisions. And so cuts had to be made to get to that level. If school divisions didn't agree to submit a balanced budget, the government would simply dismiss the school board and a new one would be elected, and then the new school board would have to go ahead and submit a balanced budget. Then the boards collected property taxes as always, submitted those property taxes to the government, and then the government went ahead and distributed all the funds. The new grant structure consists of a complex formula that is transparent. It's the first time that actually Saskatchewan has a booklet that has the grant formula in it so that people can come to some sort of understanding of how funding for school is calculated. And they use this complex formula to determine how much schools can actually budget for. So schools are no longer free to lobby their constituents or to ask exec council or whatever else what they want for the school year. Instead, they must submit a budget that is fixed according to each of the categories and each of the amounts in the formula. The board then submits this balanced budget to the government, and everybody in the province pays the provincial-wide mill rate because there's only one now. School boards are no longer allowed to set their own mill rates, and you'll remember that from the articles on the first day of class. I guess it would have been the second week of class. And then the board collects property taxes, submits them to the government, and the government distributes the money around the province according to the formula. So the biggest change, again, just to review, the old foundational operating grant, the school division would submit what they would recognize as expenditures that they were going to use for the entire year. They also knew what they could possibly collect based on revenues in their area, and I'll show you how to do all of that in about 4 weeks. And then the government would say, okay, these are what you think you're going to spend. Here's how much I think you can collect from property taxes in your area. So see, here's the amount of grant that you're getting. But with the new formula, the grant amounts are known ahead of time. And so the government actually calls the expenses actual expenses. And they're only allowed to be so much. And so school divisions are required to make sure that the revenues and expenses, when you subtract the expenses from the revenues, equals 0. And that's how the grant is determined. Why the change? Just a quick review from the second week. There were huge political pressures in the province to have a provincial-wide mill rate, likely as a result of amalgamations. When school divisions across the province amalgamated into larger school divisions so that we'd have fewer school divisions, this caused a lot of problems because some school divisions had high mill rates and others had lower, and when they would amalgamate together there were difficulties trying to figure out what the mill rate should be. Secondly, provinces to the left and right of us used a market value system to determine the values of the homes, and Saskatchewan didn't. Saskatchewan largely used replacement cost. So when SAMA decided to switch to a market value system, this drove up the value of most of the properties in the province, and so the government had to figure out a way that property taxes weren't going to go through the roof with multiple mill rates set across the province. In addition, the second point there, the government also added weights to the formula. And these weights are an attempt on the government side to reflect the actual cost of education in the school division. And so these weights can be changed by the government at any point in time if they want to place more value on one particular aspect of education or another. And don't worry, you'll understand that in a little bit because we're going to go through it on the PowerPoint. And lastly, these weights are attached to what the government calls vulnerability factors. When the formula was being devised, the way that the government did it was that they asked several chief financial officers from several school divisions across the province to come together on a committee and try to figure out what the cost drivers of education are. And so these CFOs came together and they decided that, just for example, special education costs more, or students below a certain socioeconomic level need more instruction, or things like that. I can't tell you that those two are exactly what they said, but they determined a set of criteria that they called vulnerability factors or cost drivers that made the cost of education go higher. And then they recognize these in the formula by saying that if you have more of these vulnerability factors, you will get more money on top of the foundation amount. So that is a huge change that didn't used to exist in the old formula before. As a matter of fact, the old formula was really basic for all school divisions, but it also included several line items that each school division lobbied for with the provincial government. So when I asked questions about what the old formula looked like, the answers that I received from the government and from school divisions were that each formula for each school division varied, and they were quite complex and they were quite historic, which you can see would be quite a problem. So let's take a look at what this funding formula might look like. Well, there you go. There's a diagram of the thing. I'll just make this a little bit larger. No, that's not going to work for us. The new model consists of expenses and revenues, and those are the only things that are recognized. So you can see here on this chart for expenses, there are 8 categories. Governance, which is the higher admin for every school division. Administration, that is the cost of accounting, of HR, that kind of thing. Instruction, the largest component of any school division costs. Plant operations and maintenance. Complementary services such as, what would be in there? Pre-kindergarten or hot lunch programs, things like that. Transportation, tuition fees, and expenses such as that. That is not usually a huge amount in any school division. And then debt repayment. Now, within each of those 8, there are a selection of sub-costs, and what I've done in this diagram here is shown you 5 for instruction and 2 for transportation, and we'll walk through that a little bit. So let's look at the first one, governance. Governance is a pretty simple category to determine expenses, and here they are. The governance funding formula for a school division is composed of a foundation, that base funding, and that's 57% of the formula. Plus, every school division gets per school funding amounts of 23%. Then per student funding, and so if you have a larger school division, you'll get more. If you have a smaller school division, you'll get less. And then, of course, distance funding. So if one school division is covering a huge amount of land, for example, a rural school division, they'll get more funding there than might an urban. So the governance funding formula is that simple, 4 categories. The administration funding formula is also fairly simple, and it's composed of 4 pieces. Base funding again, every single one of these formulas has a base, per student, per school, and then dispersion funding. Let's look at one that's a little bit more complex. Instruction is more complex. Instruction is composed of these 5 components. Base again, locally determined teacher benefits, school-based support, resources, and lastly, student supports for learning. Now, within each of these, even though it just looks like there are 5, there are subcategories, and we're going to just take a look at the supports for learning one. Within the supports for learning category, and that's SFL, supports for learning, the pool that you get, the amount of money that you would get in your school division, is based on intensive supports that are required, enrollment, distance, and then that vulnerability factor that we talked about already. Now, within each of these, there are subcategories again, so you can start to see this, this pyramid effect for this formula. Intensive supports are calculated this way. The amount of support that you get for learners who require intensive support is based on how many you have, but as a rate. So compared to how many students there are in the province who also have this. The reason this formula is calculated this way is that the government allots only a certain amount of money in this pool. And so in order for you to get more money than someone else from year to year, you need to have more students that have this, this problem than other school divisions, or their rates have to go down. So the prevalence rate in your school division is calculated by the number of students who require intensive supports in your school division divided by the number of students in the province who require intensive supports. And then your funding for that is going to be determined by the entire supports for learning funding pool times 25% of the weight assignment times your prevalence rate. And then that's how the money for intensive supports is calculated. Let's look at another one. We just did intensive supports. Let's look at enrollment. Enrollment funding is calculated in this way. So a similar calculation. Again, there's only a certain pool of money, and so you will get a proportion of that pool. You will get full-time equivalent student counts for the entire school division divided by full-time equivalent student counts in the entire province. And then your funding would be calculated by how much money is in the supports for learning pool times 20% weight times the proportion of enrollment. Moving on, distance. Distance is calculated this way, and I'm not going to go through all of the categories because I'm sure you can start to see patterns there. I'll just pause. And the last category, which is vulnerability. And vulnerability is calculated according to these weights. Again, low income, that's 30% of this pool. Low education, lone parent, immigration, and non-official language. And then, to add more, I guess, pieces to this umbrella, then for each of these, you get into one of those calculations. So vulnerability funding is 40%, but low income is 30% of that vulnerability funding. Then they calculate a proportion, and then it goes through the same exact pattern as the others. The pool times 40% weight, and then the vulnerability pool times 30% times your proportion in your school division. You're not expected to memorize any of these, but I'm just going to go back to one of those earlier slides right here. You can imagine the complexity of the formulas. Now, of course, all of this is calculated on computers, so it doesn't need to be done by hand at any point, but I find it quite interesting that those weight factors are there because we don't really know what those weight factors are attributed to, and I have a feeling that even by tweaking them just a little bit, we can get some pretty unique things happening to the funding formula. Or so, not to the funding formula, to the funding amounts. Now, before I let this go, I want to talk about the principles of funding that the government claims are attached to the funding formula document. I will just go to another slide here. This is what the new funding guiding principles are: mutual responsibility, accountability, transparency, equity, and stability. And not trying to add complexity to this class, but accountability means government accountability versus financial accountability. So let's go through each of these principles, the way the government intends for them to be. Mutual responsibility. The government claims that the funding model is unique to Saskatchewan and that there's a balance between provincial responsibility and Board of Education autonomy. Well, we know from the articles on the second day of class, and you can go back to them if you need to, that school division autonomy was actually eroded significantly because school divisions no longer have the privilege or the opportunity to set their own mill rates, and because they're collecting less than 50%, they're actually collecting 40%, they have very little say in how financial decisions are made. The size of the pie is a very closed amount for funding. That means there is just a pool of money available to distribute to all school divisions. So even if all school divisions had a higher need all at the same time, there would be not much more money available. Secondly, accountability. We talked about accountability in a financial sense on the second day, but this is the definition that the government chooses to use for accountability. They actually use it as being accountable for decisions and responsibility to report on those decisions. And so through the accountability framework, they require that all school divisions only use the codes, the chart of accounts codes, to place any expenses. So anything that you want to buy that's outside of that will not be allowed. Transparency. The school division claims, no, not at all school divisions, the government of Saskatchewan claims that because the formula is provided, and it is, I've uploaded the funding model to our materials for this week, that it is transparent and people can go and take a look and see how the formula is being applied, and they can understand it that way. Equity. The Ministry of Education claims that because the formula is applied across the province to everyone, that it is coming closer to equity than others, or than it would have been before. And lastly, stability. Stability refers to school divisions knowing that they will have a certain amount of funds coming in the following year or the year after that. And this is a desirable feature of any model or any amount of budgeting. This is generally true. The pool likely won't fluctuate from year to year. So reviewing, when we talked on day 2, Alden Kitchen claimed that there are 6 guiding principles of educational finance, being efficient, accountable and understandable, autonomous and flexible, predictable, stable, fair and equitable, and neutral. These are the ones that we just reviewed: mutual responsibility, accountability, transparency, equity, and stability. And those are claimed to belong to the new funding formula. And then I just put this last slide up here just to illustrate that the principles are maybe kind of similar, maybe a little bit different, and that it's necessary to zoom into those definitions in order for us to understand what they really mean. So I'll stop talking now. I've uploaded some questions and some things for you to work on and think about. I encourage you to try to understand the formula based on principles that you believe in, and to comment freely on our discussions this week.